Do you think that we've been focused so extensively on the Pakistan cat's paw that we've devoted a lot of our resources towards the Western threat rather than the Northern threat?
In world affairs, we cannot afford to be sentimental. We have to be realistic. What is Pakistan? It's a country with a GDP smaller than Tamil Nadu. So I think we are missing the point here.
What are you seeing in China vis-a-vis the maritime domain, which you specialize in?
Undoubtedly, the greatest event of the century is going to be the rise of China. So China's competition is with the United States, and its strategy for India is to tie India down to South Asia using Pakistan. China would like to see that we focus our attention on the border and thereby prevent us from dominating the Indian Ocean, which is what will disturb Mr. Xi Jinping's sleep.
What would India's grand strategy look like if it aims to raise the cost of a conflict with China?
We need maritime power projection, which is the only thing that will deter China. It's huge geographical weakness. But with an economy of 19 trillion against ours 4.5 trillion, we have to realize that we are an asymmetric power, and we therefore have to rely on the only major factor in our favor, which is our supreme maritime geography. Sandeep, I think we are hugely confused by an English word called defense
Why is that?
and a Hindi word called raksha.
Right. Don't they mean the same?
That's not what armed forces are meant for. Armed forces are meant to prevent war,
Right.
because war is one of the most destructive consequences for a nation. So we have to prevent war. And to prevent war, you must have an offensive capability that makes the enemy political leader think twice.
Hello and welcome to the Sandeep Unnithan Show, your weekly dose of defense, geopolitics, and much more. Today, I'm privileged to have on my show with me Rear Admiral Raja Menon, former Assistant Chief of Naval Staff, but more importantly, one of India's foremost maritime strategists. Admiral Menon, welcome to my show.
Thank you, Sandeep. I'm delighted to be here.
We last spoke about 9 months back, sir. So much has changed in the world, and yet so little has changed. One of those immutable factors is the rise of China.
Yes.
That continues.
Yes.
Despite the war in West Asia,
Yes.
the United States. What are you seeing in China vis-a-vis the maritime domain, which you specialize in?
Undoubtedly, the greatest event of the century is going to be the rise of China and the achievement of China's grand strategy, which is nothing fantastically new, but just going back to where China was for 2,000 years. The top of the pyramid in the Confucian order of the world, in which China is the middle kingdom and the other states pay tribute to China. What we are seeing is just a relocation of the same concept. And to achieve that, the long-term competitor of China is undoubtedly the United States. So we really need to go into the details about how is that competition going. Some of the most analytical writers on what the result of that competition are, strangely enough, China-born Americans who are already saying that China is equal to the United States in all forms of engineering and electronics, biotechnology, and there are more users in the Western world of cheap Chinese AI LLMs like Quen and Alibaba than the highly touted ChatGPT and Claude. And China is producing more research papers than the United States and has filed for more patents than the United States. The only area where the United States, I think, still holds the superiority is the nature of their competitive society. And uh, if China has not already overtaken the United States, it has already overtaken the United States in purchasing power, GDP. So the big issue for us is what is China's view of India's place in the world? And that, I'm afraid, is not very good.
How does China see India, sir?
I'll start with the declassified record of why China attacked India in 1962. Most Indians think it was over the boundary dispute. But declassified records now show that Mao Zedong called his army commander and gave him a 4-word directive: teach India a lesson. So the question is, what is that lesson? I venture to say that is, India must be taught its place in the Chinese world order as a tributary of China. That was the message. And subsequently, China has followed what I call a grand strategy, which doesn't mean it's just a big strategy, but it means certain definite things. One is that in grand strategy, war is one of the least desired options. The main objective is to win the competition, a long-term competition, using all forms of the government. So China's competition is with the United States, and its strategy for India is to tie India down to South Asia using Pakistan. So, Sandeep, if I can use an analogy, China is like a fisherman using Pakistan as the bait to catch the Indian fish. So, when we get uh, frantic about the Himalayan border and Pakistan, we are taking the Chinese bait because China's grand plan is global. It was global until uh, they attempted a strategic overstretch in Venezuela, and the United States replaced the regime and threw China out. So China has since modified its objective into phase 1, which is domination of Africa and Eurasia, and phase 2, domination of the world. But we are now concerned with the domination of Eurasia and Africa.
Are we in phase 1, sir, of this Chinese grand strategy? How do you describe China's grand strategy in the last couple of years as it's evolved?
That's a very good question, Sandeep. The only successful example of grand strategy is that followed by the United States after 1950, which resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union without going to war. And China is, in my opinion, now using a grand strategy. And that grand strategy is unlike that of the United States. The United States grand strategy, the manifestation, are the 6 theater commands: Europe Command, Africa Command, PACOM, CENTCOM, AMERICOM, and so on, Special Forces Command, and so on. China is not following that route. China is following the route of trade domination, financial help, infrastructure, technology, the international support for any regime in which war is a very low option. So, unfortunately, I don't think India has the economic heft to also craft a grand strategy. I don't think it's possible with 4.5 trillion. But even so, I admit that the nearest we come to a grand strategy is Viksit Bharat. But in my opinion, a grand strategy must have different silos of achievement. Our Viksit Bharat grand strategy does not appear to have a military silo. So that is a shortcoming.
When you say our grand strategy, that is the Viksit Bharat, doesn't have a military silo, you've actually seen statements to the effect that by 2047 we will be fully self-reliant in defense technology. We will be a major arms exporter. Where do you see the gap in statements?
Excellent question, Sandeep. Excellent question. If we look at our defense budget, what we find is that by and large, it's an accountant's budget. How much money came in and where the money is going. But that is not how large multinational firms and the United States defense budget is structured. Their budgets are structured to indicate what is the result being achieved by spending money. And that's called a program-based budget. For instance, we don't know how much money is going towards achieving air superiority, or how much money is going toward tackling the northern border or the western border, and so on. Fortunately, today we have very omnipresent artificial intelligence. So, if one was to ask this question of AI, you will get answers that are more revealing. And the artificial intelligence admits that this is not based on any government data and it is subject to correction. But the figures that we come to are that we seem to be spending 50% of our defense budget on defending the northern border, 30% on defending the western border, and 20% on the oceanic front. Against China's grand strategy, therefore, the allocation of money doesn't seem to reflect our strategic priorities.
Are you saying that you need to spend more on the maritime front as opposed to the northern front or the western front?
Well, I don't want to seem to appear partisan because I have a background in the Navy. But China's overall objective is global, in which the readjustment of the Himalayan border by a few hundred meters is inconsequential. But China would like to see that we focus our attention on the border and thereby prevent us from dominating the Indian Ocean, which is what will disturb Mr. Xi Jinping's sleep. And I'm no expert on land warfare, but what strikes me as the most significant fact of the Galwan episode, which resulted in restructuring our strategy, was this: that the Chinese troops and the Indian troops encountered each other without firearms, as agreed to earlier. But the Chinese appeared armed with steel clubs with spikes welded on all down the body, which could not have been made other than in a workshop at least a month earlier. So it was not a chance encounter. The Chinese had come prepared at Galwan, where we lost that gallant commander of the Bihar regiment. And the Indian troops retaliated with rocks and boulders picked up from the river. And it looks as though that succeeded in focusing our attention on the border and away from the Indian Ocean.
Admiral Menon, in recent months, we've seen a lot of movement in the Indian Ocean region. Uh, the government has sanctioned the Great Nicobar Island project, which you are a big votary of. The Prime Minister traveled recently to Indonesia, where we have taken up the development of Sabang port, which is a strategic port there at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca. We have also the Prime Minister also visited Australia. There's a lot of engagement going on in the Indian Ocean rim countries. Do you see this as evidence of India finally moving to checkmate China in the Indian Ocean region?
Yes, I do. These are great moves, and I commend the government for what they have done, including all that you said, Sandeep, and the establishment of a oil strategic reserve in the Middle East. These are great steps. But we must understand one thing, that the leadership of China, they consist of very hard men. And these foreign policy initiatives are beneficial and very good. But eventually, the decision that Beijing makes is going to depend on hard power. And I don't want to go into what exactly that means, but once this this line of thinking is accepted, I'm sure the services will do what they're required to do.
Right. You also mentioned early on that Pakistan is China's cat's paw. We've known that for years. They have one cat's paw for the Indian subcontinent, another cat's paw for East Asia, which is North Korea. Do you think that we've been focused so extensively on the Pakistan cat's paw that we've devoted a lot of our resources towards the Western threat rather than the Northern threat? And what do you think are the kind of budgetary allocations you would like to see towards checkmating China, be it in the Northern front or at sea?
Again, that's a very good question, Sandeep. I'm afraid that the issue of Pakistan is a hugely emotive issue. That's unfortunate.
Is it because of the religious angle?
Because of our history,
Partition.
partition, and so on. But I'm sorry, in world affairs, we cannot afford to be sentimental. We have to be realistic. What is the realistic picture? The picture is that without the tanks, guns, aircraft, ships, submarines, and most of all, missile technology, nuclear weapons, and satellite technology, what is Pakistan? It's a country with a GDP smaller than Tamil Nadu. So I think we are missing the point here. What we have to achieve is deter China from using Pakistan to tie us down. And the only answer to that is to dominate the Indian Ocean. That is not a service issue, it's an issue for India's grand strategy.
What would India's grand strategy look like if it aims to raise the cost of a conflict with China, aims to raise the cost for China in any future conflict in the Indian Ocean region?
Just look at the world map. China's geography is not just poor, it's pathetic. It's stuck at one end of the Eurasian continent. And its prosperity depends on exports and foreign trade. And 80% of that trade flows westward from China through the Indian Ocean. And they can't rely on that if they do not, if India controls, for instance, the Indian Ocean, the Malacca Strait, the Bab el Mandab, and the Suez Canal, or at least it's an arbiter as to who controls the Suez Canal. For this, we need maritime power projection, which is the only thing that will deter China. Its huge geographical weakness. But with an economy of 19 trillion against ours 4.5 trillion, we have to realize that we are an asymmetric power. And we therefore have to rely on the only major factor in our favor, which is our supreme maritime geography.
What are the aspects of India's maritime geography that give it that edge over China? One, of course, you mentioned is the fact that there are the choke points that are within reach of the Indian subcontinent. What are the other factors which we haven't paid enough attention to?
We saw what happened in the Iran war.
Right.
In the last 75 years, all the wars we have fought have not affected the economy and the prosperity of this country as much as the Iran war, a war that occurred 800 miles beyond our territorial borders. That is the effect of a world which today is economically integrated. If a country cannot remain economically integrated, it's dead. What is a country's chief vulnerabilities today? Top of the list are data centers. The one project on which the maximum amount of money is being invested worldwide. And what is a data center? It's a big, huge concrete structure which any missile can knock down, followed by things like space connectivity, internet, international payment systems, your trade routes, supply chains, critical minerals, oil reserves, electricity grid. These are the state's vulnerabilities. The vulnerability of a state today is not territory. That era is gone. The era when we occupied Dhaka and forced Pakistan into a favorable peace talks in Simla in 1972, that era is gone because of many reasons. One is nuclear weapons. In 1999, Prime Minister Vajpayee refused the pleas of General Malik to allow the Indian Armed Forces to cross the LOC. There are other reasons. One of them is the lessons of the Ukraine war. What is the biggest lesson of the Ukraine war? It is that the biggest vulnerability of the armed forces is the human soldier. The drones about which there is so much hysteria in the world today was the 80% cause of creating 1.4 million Russian casualties by either FPV, direct attack on a soldier, or the dropping of explosives by quadcopters. So, this business of holding ground with boots on the ground, that's gone. The new vulnerabilities are what I listed.
So do you believe that these two wars, that the 88-hour Operation Sindoor that we saw last year, and of course the Iran-US-Israel war, are actually what wars of the future are going to be? Non-contact, kinetic, without forces crossing borders and holding territory.
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely right. And I'm not saying something revolutionary here. I think by and large that has been accepted by the higher service organizations. I based that comment on the interview that I read in the Week magazine of General Chauhan, where he more or less articulates what exactly you said, Sandeep.
So, and the other aspect that we've seen in wars of the recent few years is the fact that technology favors the defender greatly. And we've seen that in the case of Iran and to some extent with Ukraine, with Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine, despite losing so much of its territory, has managed to inflict a lot of pain on Russia. Does that augur well for India's defense against China?
Um, I think the scenario for an India-China conflict is vastly different. It's substantially different. And I think we must also differentiate between the lessons from the Ukraine war and the Iran war. The biggest failure of the United States in the Iran war was that the conversion of President Trump's political objective into a military strategy was a big blunder, more than a blunder, because this successful translation depends on a frank conversation between the military and the political class. In the case of the United States, it was not a frank conversation, it was no conversation. And that is the primary reason for the fact that the United States did not achieve its objective. In the Ukraine war, I'm afraid there are questions of professional competence that arises from the performance of the Russian armed forces. But not very relevant to this discussion.
Right. And, in the case of India, for instance, we've been debating on theater commands, for
Yes.
instance. That's been on for 7-8 years now. We also see, the demands for a conventional missile force. And the Air Force seems to be not in favor of this because it kind of takes away from the Air Force's role. How do you see this battle playing out? The fact you need integrated theater commands?
I don't know what the exact form of the theater command is going to take. But when the subject was first mooted, I did send a paper to the CDS on what I thought would be the ideal theater command. And my big objection to what might emerge is that we are conferring a great power status on this country with a GDP smaller than Tamil Nadu. We are planning a 5-domain tri-service theater command against this feeble country, which is where we are indicating that we are swallowing the Chinese bait. It would make sense if our Western theater was to expand continentally up to the Red Sea. That makes sense. But will that create ripples in the international arena? I think it will. So, this decision is at the political level. But what I think is going to emerge, I don't think is going to advance India's cause in any way.
What is an alternate view of this? I mean, how do you see restructuring for a military architecture that will serve in India's interests in the next 20 years or so?
I want to point out to those who are in the know that China has global ambitions. But look at China's theater commands. They are entirely continental. Does that mean China does not have global ambitions? Of course not. So, if the government of India is shy, and justifiably so, of declaring Indian theater command beyond the borders of India, then the answer would lie in not going into theater commands, but fighting the war in theaters. Just declaration of theater command doesn't stop us from fighting the war by theaters.
Right. And you've also, over the years, Admiral Menon, you've made the point for interdiction of Chinese shipping in the Malacca Strait, we've seen that happening with this choke point warfare that you've spoken about. We saw that happening in literally at the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran continues to exercise its chokehold over two and possibly control a third out of the 7 choke points in the world. Do you see choke point warfare as one way for India to raise the costs of conflict for China?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not saying that we indulge in choke point warfare, but we hold out the threat of choke point warfare. Unfortunately, that's the only option we have. As I said, with a 4.5 trillion economy against a 19 trillion economy, that is our only option.
And if an Indian maritime strategy were to focus on this, what are the kind of expenses that you would see? How much would it cost us really? What kind of reorientation of our strategy would it take? What kind of assets would we have to build up? Could you give us an idea of what this would entail?
There is today, and I'm not going into what I think, but what is established. There is a certain hierarchy of deciding what a service strategy is. It draws from a national security strategy, which draws from national security objectives, which goes beyond military objectives. It goes into things like digital sovereignty,
Yes.
energy security, safety of 4 million Indians in the Gulf, and other factors. So, and the national security objectives are derived from documents like the Constitution,
Right.
national values, and so on. Unfortunately, these non service directives have yet to be issued.
Right.
So, in their absence, the services have to find their own way. And that's what the services are doing today. But definitely, one of the objectives is territorial defense, which is not adequate for the 21st century because the vulnerabilities go beyond borders. And therefore, this needs urgent attention.
And this point that you made, Admiral Menon, about choke point warfare, the fact that we need to reorient our budgets, capabilities. Do you see a country like India being able to do that, given the fact that it's, say, regimes like Iran that can do things like this, North Korea that can do stuff like this, but can India actually do resort to something like this, which will paint it as the bad boy, doing something when you're one of the countries that advocates for freedom of navigation at sea, for instance?
We should continue to say that we are for freedom of navigation.
Right.
But what that means in actual practice can be what we conceive, which is that a hostile power to India cannot get away with depending upon open seas.
Right.
Open seas in peace, yes. Open seas in a hostile environment, no.
So these contingencies would come into effect only in case of conflict.
Or to prevent conflict. That's another issue.
Right.
Sandeep, I think we are hugely confused by an English word called defense
Why is that?
and a Hindi word called raksha.
Right. Don't they mean the same?
That's not what armed forces are meant for. Armed forces are meant to prevent war.
Right.
Because war is one of the most destructive consequences
Yes.
for a nation. So we have to prevent war. And to prevent war, you must have an offensive capability that makes the enemy political leader think twice.
There's friends of mine in the Air Force who say that pretty much the same, that, we have this concept of defense. I was just remembering what Air Marshal Deeptendu keeps talking about, the fact that the Air Force is actually an instrument, it's an offensive instrument of offensive power. And whereas our strategy is more defensive oriented. So, which is why, do you think that is one of the reasons why the Air Force is the last to be deployed in any conflict, whether it should have been the other way around?
Well, well, Marshal Chaudhary is a good friend of mine, and we have great conversations between us. And I support the Air Force in its stand
Right.
that the resolution of conflicts depends on dominance of the air, no question.
Right.
And that's one of the big lessons, which I didn't want to go into, of the Ukraine war. In Moscow, the belief about the role of the armed forces is derived from the Soviet Union days. And in the Soviet Union, the primary objective of the country was to defend the Communist Party. And to defend the Communist Party, the Air Force and the Navy had no role. It could only be defended by the army.
Right.
Therefore, the general staff in Moscow was dominated by the army. And the Navy and the Air Force had subordinate roles. And this is what happened in Ukraine. The Air Force was not allowed to act as an independent service. It was used by the huge Russian armored column
Right.
of 6,000 tanks as something like an airborne artillery,
Right.
which forced the Russian Air Force to fly low. And they got shot down by the hundreds of Stinger missiles supplied by the Americans. So that war doesn't teach us any useful lesson. But you saw, for instance, the complete freedom with which the Israeli and the American Air Force rampaged over Iran.
Right.
That's how Air Forces are meant to be used.
Right. And therefore you need a lot of fighter aircraft. You need manned fighters.
Definitely.
And you need
Definitely.
offensive air power.
Yes.
But when you're looking at instruments of offensive maritime power, what are the instruments that we really need? Do we have enough of those instruments?
Not at the moment. Not at the moment. Because I think the most fearsome weapon today in all the three services is the nuclear-powered attack submarine, carrying 40 vertical launch silos. That's what we need. And that's what makes a hostile country think twice. But I don't see a difficulty in going down that route. We have brilliant technical people in the maritime arena. Just give them a chance and they'll produce the goods.
But why is it that we've got an Arihant class series of ballistic missile submarines? Why is it that we've not had SSNs to complement them? I believe there was a plan in the 90s to have both of these parallel, but we chose one over the other. Why did that happen?
That's a question of priorities, of defense priorities, which comes from higher defense thinking, which comes from the conversation between the defense and the political authority. We need to clear up that chain first.
Right.
And that's what I'm suggesting now.
But we have one submarine that's coming on lease from
Yes.
the Russian Federation,
Yes.
the Chakra
Yes.
3, in a few years.
Yes.
Will one submarine be enough?
Not at all. Not at all.
What is the
Not
number
at all.
that you have in mind?
Well, the primary weapon of the attack submarine today is not only total capability of sea denial. That's just by the way. It is also a land attack weapon.
Right.
And we need enough vertical launch silos to affect the thinking of the enemy country. And I would put that at a total Indian capability of not less than 6 to 8,000.
6 to 8,000 vertical
6 to
launch
8,000
silos.
vertical launch silos altogether, of which the Navy can comfortably field 4,000.
Right.
3,000 on board destroyers and 1,000 on board SSNs.
Right. And these would be tools that you could use to make China think twice before launching any offensive.
Yes,
against
Sandeep,
us.
we are not exploiting the advances in technology. Today, you can build a ship with a land attack capability,
Right.
anti submarine capability, anti ship capability, and anti missile capability all in the same hull.
Right.
We must exploit that advantage. The most brilliant defense industry in India today is naval shipbuilding.
Yes.
Give the boys a chance, they'll deliver the goods.
I was looking at the timelines for how long it takes us to build warships. Anything between 6 and 8 years for frigates and destroyers. The Chinese and the Japanese now building frigates and destroyers at the rate of one every 2 or 3 years. Does that worry you a lot?
Let's first give the shipyard a chance. Let's give the private sector a chance. Let them try and solve this problem that you've raised. If they can't solve it, then we can attempt to intervene. But for heaven's sake, let the competition work.
Right. When you were talking about grand strategy, Admiral Menon, I was thinking about the fact that there's been considerable debate about where is India's national security strategy. You mentioned that we don't have one yet. It was supposed to have come out some years back. Do you see this as holding us back in our drive to Viksit Bharat? The fact that we don't have a written, articulated national security strategy, is that a problem?
It is a problem. It is a problem not stated because I'm saying it. That's the view of the three services. So I think that should be taken into account because that will more logically explain what we are spending our money on
Right.
to achieve what outcome.
So the Raksha Mantri's operational directives, which is what is a substitute for a national security strategy, that does not work in this context.
No, it can work, but it needs constant upgradation.
Right.
I'm not in the know of what's the date of the last directive, but that's up to the services to speak on.
Right. And national security strategy, if you can, give our viewers of what a national security strategy should look like for India, a $4.5 trillion economy, which hopes to be a developed country in the next 20 years or so, 4 times the economy it has today. What should a national security strategy for India look like?
You remember, Sandeep, I listed what the vulnerabilities of a modern state is.
Right.
We need to take that list and ensure that we can protect those and threaten the same list of the enemy country. Whoever the political class decide is our enemy country. We need to threaten those and defend ours. I think the national security strategy should look at that. That includes digital sovereignty, energy security, electricity generation,
Food security.
and a whole number of.
Right.
I mean, what the destruction of these will achieve
Right.
is that it will make a country deaf, dumb, mute, and in total darkness. That's the future of warfare.
Right. How is this different from wars as they were fought in the past? Is it possible to achieve these effects far quickly with the kind of technologies that we are seeing today? For instance, algorithmic warfare, which integrates assets, which has thinking machines, for instance.
Definitely. As far as that is concerned, we made a lot of progress with the present CDS and the integrated defense staff. They are talking about what you say, multi-domain warfare. That's all good. But when it comes to kinetic warfare,
Right.
we have to decide what is the targeting list. And there I think we need to up our thinking a bit.
When you say targeting list, it's the list of the target folder that the armed forces have of their adversary nations.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's the biggest, I would say, the biggest technology lesson that's come out of the Iran war. The Iran war indicated that the United States was able to generate a targeting list daily of more than 400 targets based upon extensive satellite surveillance, electronic surveillance, and so on, fed into a project called Project Maven. And I'm sure we are capable of producing the same kind of targeting list, but we must first realize the necessity of waging war in that manner.
Do you believe that our adversaries, and China is of course one of them, would actually plan to use these kind of capabilities against us? And if so, how do you build resilience the way the Iranians did?
At the moment, the China is not intending to do anything of the kind against us. How do I say that? Because China puts out what it intends to do in documents.
Right.
Those documents are available on the web. What are these documents? 5-year plans, Communist Party doctrines, military strategy guidelines, which is their form of military strategy,
Right.
and defense upgradation plans. And in all these, China clearly articulates what the threat is, which is coming from the Pacific. India figures nowhere as a threat, other than a minor footnote which says limited war under informationalized condition. It doesn't say India, but the worst you can assume is that that refers to us. Limited war.
Right. So China is a large amount of their mind space is still taken up by the United States and the Pacific War.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we are talking about 5,000 missiles, 6,000 missile targets and all that. An exchange between the United States and China is going to involve targeting something like 20,000 targets, which goes from north of Japan all the way to Guam, Honolulu, first island chain, second island chain, and the same number of targets in mainland China. That's going to be on a different scale,
Right.
what they're preparing for.
And that scale is something that would itself deter a conflict of this from breaking out.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also want to say that we have to, in all the military colleges of the world,
Right.
the prime source is Clausewitz.
Right.
Claus von Clausewitz,
Yes.
including in ours.
Right.
But the number 2 position in all military colleges is Sun Tzu. He left behind a lot of Chinese sayings, which in the old days people used to generally laugh at, saying, old Chinese saying. But the Chinese armed forces today follow Sun Tzu. The number 1 aphorism is that a ruler, which means government, must choose war only as the last option, because war is as destructive to one's own country, second only to an enemy invasion. That's what he said.
Right. Which is why the Chinese haven't fought a war in almost half a century.
And the second thing that Sun Tzu said is that to fight and win in distant wars, you need to, in inverted commas, shape the environment. I don't know Chinese, but that's the best translation that comes out of what the Chinese said. Shape the environment. That's what they're doing to us.
How so?
They gave nuclear weapons to Pakistan in 1980.
Right.
We didn't seem to have read the signal. Then they fed them with, as I said, aircraft, tanks, guns, ships, airplanes. The Pakistan Earth Observation Satellite of India is a Chinese satellite launched in China.
Right.
The ability of the Pakistan Air Force to launch air-to-air missile is based on software that was installed by the Chinese. So they are shaping the environment. Fortunately, the Foreign Office seems to have realized this shaping the environment, because they tried to get into Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and diplomatically we seem to have taken countermeasures. But hard power, not yet.
But, of late, Admiral Menon, there's been a spate of BrahMos missile transfers. A colleague of mine has just written a piece on that, Deepak Badana, on how India seems to be playing China's game now, paying China back in the same coin, though not in the nuclear domain. But we've been selling the BrahMos missile, a very capable missile. It's a naval missile, of course, which first to the Philippines, then to Indonesia now, and
Yes.
to Vietnam.
Yes.
Are we checkmating China by transferring these kind of things? What kind of...
I think those are very good moves. As I said earlier, there seems to be a number of things going on. But my only complaint is that that is not enough. We need to demonstrate a little more hard power in the ocean.
Right. And by that, do you mean the kind of assets like nuclear-powered attack submarines, or is it transfers to friendly nations of warships? Or
Well, that let's be clear about one thing, which is that a nation is not going to suffer human casualties for another nation.
right?
So, Quad and all that, good.
Yeah.
But if we think that the Americans are going to accept body bags
Right.
to defend India, we are being naive.
Right.
Where the United States comes in, as far as we are concerned, is technology. United States technology is world standard, and therefore we need relationships.
Right. But the Americans don't share technology very easily. One of their top officers once told me that you're asking us for technology. We don't even give our closest allies. Do you see that as a problem?
That is a problem. Every institution in India has a problem.
Right.
The defense forces have a problem in defending. The diplomats have a problem in foreign affairs. That is a foreign affairs problem.
Right.
I'm sorry, they have to solve it.
Right.
How they do it is their business. That's what they're paid for. They have to convince the Americans that technology transfer to India is to a mutual benefit. How they do it is up to them.
But, they've not had a track record of ever sharing technology with us, as opposed to, say, the Soviet Union and first, and now the Russian Federation. The BrahMos is a classic example of that. Dr. Pillai was here, and he was talking about how it was actually authorized by the president himself. President Putin would interfere every time he had a problem. He would go to him. You don't see that kind of cooperation from the Americans. On the contrary, you actually see
From
America.
the Russians.
Well, you don't see the Americans doing this kind of technology transfer. On the other hand, you actually see a lot of strings attached to even conventional platforms sold off the shelf, where engines don't come up in time, they're not delivered, there are strings attached, supply chain issues, all of that happening.
I agree. These are problems. But that's why we have the MEA. They have to look after the external relations of this country.
Right.
And I don't envy. I mean, I have told many of my friends in the MEA that I don't envy their task, for instance, in creating peace with Pakistan. I don't envy them one bit. They have a difficult task,
Right.
just as we have a difficult task. So each institution must work
Right.
to the betterment of the country.
Right. Absolutely. And on that note, Admiral Menon, such a pleasure speaking with
Wonderful.
you, as always.
Wonderful, Sandeep.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Great morning.